When the judge's gavel fell, Valerie lost everything to a cheating billionaire husband. Left with $34 and a trash bag of clothes, her only lifeline was a bizarre inheritance, a rotting, abandoned psychiatric hospital. But beneath its terrifying padded cells lay a secret that would shatter high society forever. The marble floors of the Manhattan family court had never felt so cold. Valerie stood frozen, the ink barely dry, on a divorce decree that officially erased 10 years of her life. Across the aisle, Preston adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke Brioni suit, a smirk playing on his lips. Beside him was Savannah, his former personal assistant, now wearing the 5-carat Graf diamond ring that had once belonged to Valerie's grandmother. Preston was a hedge fund manager with deep ties to the Vanguard Group. He was ruthless calculating, and as Valerie had learned too late, a master of legal manipulation. The prenuptial agreement she had blindly signed at 22, back when she was a naive art history major, and he was an up-and-coming trader, had an obscure infidelity clause. But Preston's lawyers, a high-powered team from Skadden Arps, Slatemerger, and Flom, hadn't just used the clause. They had inverted it. They fabricated a paper trail complete with doctored emails and paid witnesses accusing Valerie of financial embezzlement and an affair with a contractor. The judge, a man who regularly golfed at Preston's country club in the Hamptons, didn't look Valerie in the eye as he ruled. She was stripped of the penthouse in Tribeca, the estate in Southampton, and access to all joint accounts. She was left with the clothes on her back, a 2014 Honda Accord, and absolute destitution. For 3 weeks, Valerie lived in her car in a bleak strip mall parking lot in Yonkers. The glamorous life of charity galas and private jets was replaced by the harsh reality of washing her face in gas station restrooms and eating stale saltines. The isolation was absolute. The elite social circles she once moved in had instantly blacklisted her, terrified of crossing Preston. Then, on a freezing Tuesday morning, her cracked iPhone buzzed. "Valerie, this is Harrison Gable. I'm an attorney with Gable and Associates." A gravelly voice echoed through the static. "I am the executor of the estate for your great-uncle Thaddeus Carmichael. He passed away 2 weeks ago, and you need to come to my office immediately. You are his sole beneficiary." Valerie gripped the steering wheel. Thaddeus Carmichael was the black sheep of her mother's family, a former industrial engineer who had made a small fortune in the 1970s. He had suffered a severe nervous breakdown, becoming a recluse. The family whispered that he was insane, a paranoid hoarder who spent his final decades completely off the grid. She hadn't seen him since she was 8 years old. An hour later, Valerie sat in Gable's dusty wood-paneled office in Midtown. Gable, a tired-looking man with wire-rimmed glasses, pushed a thick manila folder across the desk. Thaddeus didn't have liquid assets to his name, Valerie. His bank accounts at Chase Manhattan were drained years ago. Gable explained, his tone sympathetic but clinical. However, he did own one piece of real estate outright. He purchased it at a municipal auction in 1982 for practically nothing, and the property taxes were paid in advance for 50 years. Gable opened the folder, revealing a faded black-and-white aerial photograph of a massive, sprawling Gothic compound surrounded by dense forest. "He left you the Oakhaven Sanatorium," Gable said. Valerie stared at the photograph, her stomach dropping. Oakhaven. The name alone carried a heavy, dark history in upstate New York. Built in 1904, it was a sprawling psychiatric facility in the Catskills, notorious for its brutal, archaic treatments. It was shuttered by the state in 1978 after a series of horrific scandals involving patient neglect. It had sat abandoned ever since a magnet for urban explorers and ghost hunters, until Thaddeus bought it and fenced it off with razor wire. An abandoned asylum. Valerie whispered the absurdity of the situation, making her lightheaded. Harrison, I have $30 to my name. I'm sleeping in my car. What am I supposed to do with a rotting hospital? Sell the land, Gable suggested gently. The building is likely condemned, but the property sits on 200 acres of prime Catskills timberland. It will take time to clear the zoning and find a commercial buyer, but eventually it could be worth a few $100,000. Until then, you have the legal right to occupy the premises. Thaddeus actually lived in the old administrative wing. The news of the inheritance leaked fast. By the time Valerie walked out of the law office, her phone pinged with a text from Preston. An insane asylum for the insane ex-wife. Fitting. Enjoy the rats, Val. Tears of humiliation pricked her eyes, but a sudden hard resolve solidified in her chest. Preston wanted her broken. He wanted her to crawl back and beg for a meager settlement. But Valerie was done begging. She had a roof over her head, even if that roof belonged to a haunted, decaying hospital. She got into her Honda-typed Oak Haven Sanatorium, into her GPS, and drove north into the mountains. The wrought iron gates of Oak Haven towered over the overgrown access road like jagged teeth against the grey sky. Thick vines of poison ivy choked the stone pillars, and a rusted sign warned, "Private property. Extreme danger. Trespassers will be prosecuted." Valerie used the heavy brass key Gable had given her to unlock the padlock. The heavy chains clattered to the asphalt, echoing through the desolate woods. As she drove up the cracked, weed-choked driveway, the sheer, terrifying scale of the sanatorium revealed itself. It was a monstrous structure of dark red brick and slate roofing, shaped like a massive bat with wings extending into different wards. The windows were either boarded up or shattered, staring out like hollow, dead eyes. The air here was heavy, thick with the smell of wet earth, rotting wood, and something metallic like old copper. Armed with a heavy-duty maglite flashlight and a crowbar she had bought at a local hardware store, with her last few dollars, Valerie approached the heavy oak front doors. They swung open with a sickening groan. The main lobby was a cavernous tomb. Plaster had collapsed from the ceiling, burying the original mosaic tile floors under mounds of white debris. Overturned wheelchairs rusted in the corners, and the walls were covered in peeling green paint that hung like dead skin. The silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic dripping of water from somewhere deep within the structure. It was terrifying yet. As Valerie swept her flashlight across the grand rotting staircase, she felt a strange sense of ownership. It was ugly and broken, but it was hers. Following Gable's instructions, she navigated the labyrinthine corridors toward the East Wing, where the administrative offices were located. This was where Thaddeus had lived. When she finally pushed open the door marked Chief of Psychiatry, the beam of her flashlight revealed a shocking contrast. Unlike the rest of the hospital, this massive suite had been heavily fortified and retrofitted. Thick, moving blankets were nailed over the windows for insulation. A large cast-iron wood stove sat in the center, its chimney piped out through a broken pane. And books, thousands of them, were stacked in dizzying towers that reached the ceiling. There was a cot in the corner, a camping stove, and a massive drafting table covered in schematics ledgers and architectural blueprints. Thaddeus hadn't just been squatting here. He had been working. Valerie spent her first 3 days surviving on canned soup filtering rainwater and cleaning out the dust and grime of Thaddeus's quarters. At night, the asylum came alive with terrifying noises. The wind howling through the empty elevator shafts sounded like screaming women, and the settling of the massive foundation mimicked heavy footsteps. She slept with the crowbar across her chest, jumping at every shadow. But by the 4th day, fear gave way to intense curiosity. Thaddeus's journals stacked haphazardly on the desk were not the ramblings of a madman. They were meticulous, obsessive logs. He had recorded structural load capacities, geological surveys of the bedrock beneath the Catskills, and hundreds of references to a specific set of dates in the early 1930s. One evening, while trying to organize the drafting table by the light of a kerosene lantern, Valerie unrolled a massive blueprint of Oakhaven, dated 1904. Underneath it was a second blueprint, this one hand-drawn by Thaddeus, overlaid on tracing paper. Valerie frowned, leaning closer. The original architectural plans showed a standard foundation with a morgue and a boiler room in the basement. But Thaddeus's overlay showed something else. He had shaded in a massive blank void beneath the West Wing's hydrotherapy ward. According to Thaddeus's notes, the square footage of the basement didn't match the exterior dimensions of the building. There was a discrepancy of nearly 4,000 square feet, a hidden sector. Beside the tracing paper, Thaddeus had written a single cryptic note in thick red ink. The wealthy do not trust banks when the sky falls. They trust stone. 1929. Valerie's heart began to race. The stock market crash of 1929, the Great Depression. What did an abandoned asylum have to do with the banking collapse? The next morning, armed with her mag light, a sledgehammer and a dust mask, Valerie ventured into the West Wing. The hydrotherapy ward was the most disturbing part of Oakhaven. Rows of deep, rusted cast-iron tubs lined the tiled room, complete with heavy leather restraints still dangling from the walls. The air here was freezing, plunging 10 degrees the moment she crossed the threshold. According to Thaddeus's map, the entrance to the void wasn't in the hallway. It was behind the old boiler room, directly beneath this ward. She found the concrete stairs leading down her boots, slipping on the slick, algae-covered steps. The basement was pitch black. Her flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing massive rusted water tanks and a jungle of iron pipes. She navigated through the mechanical graveyard, counting her steps, matching them to the pacing Thaddeus had logged in his journal, 40 paces past the primary incinerator. Look for the false brickwork. She stopped. The wall in front of her looked like solid, damp brick covered in decades of black mold. But as she stepped closer, wiping the grime away with her gloved hand, she noticed the mortar. It was a slightly different color, lighter, newer than the 1904 construction. Valerie swung the sledgehammer. The impact vibrated up her arms, jarring her teeth, but the brick cracked. She swung again and again, adrenaline flooding her system. On the 7th strike, a large section of the wall collapsed inward in a cloud of choking ancient dust. She coughed, waving the dust away, and shined her light into the hole. It wasn't dirt or foundation behind the brick. It was steel. Valerie used the crowbar to pry away the remaining bricks, tearing her gloves and scraping her knuckles until she cleared a space large enough to step through. She climbed over the rubble and stood up. Before her was a sight that defied all logic. Embedded in the bedrock beneath the rotting asylum was a massive circular vault door. It was easily 10 feet in diameter, constructed of brushed titanium and solid steel, featuring a complex, multi-spoked locking wheel. It looked like the entrance to a Federal Reserve Bank, completely out of place beneath a derelict 1904 hospital. Engraved into the center of the steel wheel was a crest Valerie immediately recognized from her art history days, a crest belonging to one of the most powerful secretive banking syndicates of the Gilded Age, a consortium that had supposedly dissolved in the 1930s. To the right of the massive door was a modern digital keypad wired into a heavy-duty marine battery. Thaddeus had installed it. He had found the vault, and he had spent decades trying to bypass it. Taped to the keypad was a small yellowed index card in Thaddeus's jagged handwriting. Preston's greed is paper. This is the Earth. The code is your mother's birthday, Val. I kept it safe for you. Valerie's breath hitched in her throat. Her hands were shaking violently as she reached out. She punched in the 6 digits, 081456. A heavy electronic beep echoed through the cavern. Then a massive mechanical clack thundered through the floorboards. The gigantic steel wheel hissed, releasing a century of pressurized, stagnant air, and slowly, the vault door began to swing open. The heavy titanium door groaned against a century of inertia, its massive hinges shedding flakes of rust as it swung outward. A rush of cold, perfectly preserved and intensely dry air washed over Valerie, smelling faintly of machine oil and aged paper. Her hands trembled so violently, she nearly dropped her heavy mag light. She stepped through the circular threshold, the beam of her flashlight piercing the suffocating darkness of the hidden void. What lay before her was not a basement. It was a subterranean fortress, an architectural marvel built entirely out of reinforced concrete and riveted steel plates. The vault was the size of a collegiate gymnasium, and it was entirely climate-controlled by a passive geothermal ventilation system that had somehow survived the decades. Valerie swept her flashlight across the vast expanse, her breath catching in her throat. Arranged in meticulous symmetrical rows were hundreds of heavy wooden shipping pallets. Resting upon them were thousands of rotting canvas sacks, their fabric disintegrating from age. Where the canvas had split, the contents spilled out onto the steel floor, catching the harsh white beam of her flashlight and reflecting it back in a blinding, hypnotic yellow hue. Gold. There were mountains of it. Solid, heavy ingots of gold bullion stacked like cordwood. Valerie stumbled forward, dropping to her knees beside the nearest pallet. She reached out her gloved fingers, brushing against the cold, dense metal. She picked up a single bar. It weighed roughly 27 pounds. Stamped into the face of the ingot was the majestic eagle of the United States Treasury, accompanied by an assay mark dated 1931 and the engraved insignia of the J.P. Morgan banking syndicate. My God! Valerie whispered the sound, evaporating into the cavernous space. She moved down the aisle, her light revealing more than just precious metals. There were dozens of massive Mosler safe deposit boxes lining the far wall. Some of them had been cracked open by Thaddeus, their contents laid out on a long mahogany table. Valerie approached the table and found neatly stacked piles of bearer bonds issued by the Pennsylvania Railroad, Standard Oil, and Carnegie Steel. Because they were bearer bonds, they belonged to whoever physically held them. They were entirely untraceable and with accumulated interest, over 80 years worth an astronomical fortune. But the true treasure was not the gold or the bonds. It was a collection of leather-bound ledgers resting beside a pristine, untouched wooden crate stamped with the seal of the Louvre Museum. Valerie opened the largest ledger. The pages were thick parchment, filled with elegant fountain pen cursive. It was a master accounting book, detailing a massive conspiracy that rewrote the history of the Great Depression. In 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had signed Executive Order 6102, making it a criminal offense for American citizens to hoard gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates. The American public had been forced to surrender their wealth to the Federal Reserve. But the ultra-wealthy, the untouchable elite of Manhattan, the industrial titans, and the corrupt bankers had not surrendered a single ounce. Instead, a syndicate of billionaires had pooled their resources. They chose Oak Haven Sanatorium, a facility they covertly funded, as the perfect hiding place. Who would ever look for the greatest accumulation of wealth in human history beneath a lunatic asylum filled with society's forgotten souls? As Valerie turned the fragile pages, her eyes scanned the names of the depositors, the Astors, the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, and then her heart stopped. There on page 42 was a signature that made her blood run ice cold: Montgomery Winthrop, Preston's great-grandfather. The ledger detailed a deposit of 60,000 ounces of gold from the Winthrop family estate. But beneath the financial transaction was a supplementary dossier, meticulously maintained by the sanatorium's original director. Montgomery Winthrop had not just hidden his wealth here. He had utilized the patients of Oakhaven for horrific, unregulated pharmaceutical testing on behalf of early defense contractors. He had accumulated his fortune through the systematic torture and exploitation of the vulnerable, receiving massive, undocumented kickbacks from chemical companies. Thaddeus had left a final note tucked inside the ledger. Valerie the gold is the bait. The ledger is the blade. The Winthrop empire is built on the bones of the innocent. Burn Preston to the ground. Valerie sat in the freezing vault for hours, surrounded by billions of dollars in unregistered, untaxed wealth. The terrified, broken woman who had washed her face in a Yonkers gas station was dead. In her place, a cold, calculating architect of vengeance was born. The next morning, Valerie packed 3 gold bars into a heavy canvas duffel bag. She drove her battered Honda out of the Catskills and straight into Manhattan. She bypassed the massive banks and headed for a discreet, unmarked brownstone on the Upper East Side. It was the private residence of Nathaniel Pierce, a notoriously tight-lipped, high-end antiquities appraiser who had formerly served as the head of authentication for Sotheby's. Valerie knew him from her days organizing charity art auctions. He was one of the few men in the city who despised Preston Winthrop's arrogant new money tactics. When Valerie dumped the 3 ingots onto Pierce's velvet-lined desk, the elderly appraiser dropped his monocle. "Where on earth did you acquire pre-confiscation Treasury gold, Valerie?" Pierce gasped, tracing the J.P. Morgan stamp with a trembling finger. "These have been off the market for nearly a century. A single bar at auction with this provenance would fetch millions from historical collectors." "Nathaniel," Valerie said, her voice entirely devoid of emotion, "I need to liquidate these quietly. I need untraceable capital routed through offshore accounts that the IRS and Skadden Arps cannot touch. And I need a corporate lawyer who hates my ex-husband as much as I do. Can you help me?" Pierce looked at the gold, then up at Valerie's fierce, unyielding eyes. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. "My dear, for this kind of leverage, I will build you an empire by sunset." Over the next 6 months, Oakhaven Sanatorium became the center of a phantom financial web. Pierce connected Valerie with a syndicate of discreet Swiss bankers in Zurich and a brilliant corporate attorney in London. Valerie established a blind trust in the Cayman Islands under the name Carmichael Holdings. She slowly, methodically liquidated a fraction of the bearer bonds and the gold, funneling hundreds of millions of dollars into legitimate, untraceable shell companies. Simultaneously, she hired a private security contractor comprised of former Navy SEALs to quietly guard the perimeter of the Catskills estate, ensuring the vault remained an impenetrable fortress. Nobody knew that the penniless ex-wife was now sitting on a liquid fortune that rivaled the GDP of a small island nation. While Valerie was building her phantom empire, Preston Winthrop was drowning in his own hubris. Preston's hedge fund, Winthrop Capital Management, had grown aggressively heavily backed by institutional money from Wall Street giants like Goldman Sachs. But Preston had grown reckless, driven by his insatiable greed and the expensive demands of his new wife, Savannah Preston, had over-leveraged his fund by heavily shorting a rising tech conglomerate. When the market unexpectedly rallied, Winthrop Capital faced a catastrophic short squeeze. Preston was hemorrhaging tens of millions of dollars a day. Desperate, he began taking out massive high-interest loans from private equity firms, putting up his Tribeca penthouse, the Hamptons estate, and his firm's remaining assets as collateral. He didn't know that the private equity firm eagerly buying up his distressed debt was a subsidiary of Carmichael Holdings. Valerie owned every single cent of his liabilities. The trap was fully set by late November. The social event of the season was the Winter Solstice Gala held in the Grand Ballroom of the Plaza Hotel. It was the nexus of New York high society, a gathering of billionaires, politicians, and media moguls. Preston and Savannah were attending, desperate to project an image of wealth and stability to keep their panicked investors at bay. The ballroom was a sea of bespoke tuxedos, Oscar de la Renta gowns, and flowing Dom Perignon. Preston stood near the ice sculpture, forcing a confident smile as he lied to a group of Vanguard executives about his fund's quarterly projections. Savannah clung to his arm, flashing the 5-carat graph diamond, completely oblivious to her husband's impending financial doom. Then the murmurs began. A ripple of stunned silence spread through the ballroom, parting the crowd like the Red Sea. The string quartet missed a beat, their bows faltering on the strings. Preston turned around, his fake smile freezing into a mask of pure shock. Walking down the grand staircase was Valerie. She was unrecognizable from the shattered woman in the courtroom. She wore a custom deep emerald gown by Alexander McQueen that fit her like liquid silk. But it was the jewelry that stopped the breath of every billionaire in the room. Around her neck rested the infamous Tsarina's tear, a massive, flawless diamond necklace that had vanished during the Russian Revolution. Valerie had found it in a lockbox at Oakhaven. It was worth more than Preston's entire hedge fund. She looked radiant, powerful, and utterly terrifying. "Valerie!" Preston choked out his champagne flute, slipping slightly in his sweaty grip. Savannah's face turned the color of ash as she stared at the necklace, suddenly acutely aware of how small her own diamond looked. Valerie glided across the marble floor, stopping inches from Preston. The surrounding crowd had gone dead silent, eagerly watching the drama unfold. "Hello, Preston," Valerie said, her voice smooth and chillingly calm. "You look tired. Margin calls keeping you up at night." Preston's face flushed dark red. "How did you get in here? You don't belong in this circle anymore. You're entirely broke. That jewelry has to be a paste fake." "Is it?" Valerie asked softly. She gestured for her escort to step forward. Harrison Gable, the once tired estate lawyer, now wearing a sharply tailored Tom Ford suit, handed Valerie a thick manila folder. "I bought a few things recently," Valerie announced, raising her voice just enough to carry to the surrounding investors. "I bought the mortgage on your Tribeca penthouse. I bought the deed to the Southampton estate. And as of 3 hours ago, Carmichael Holdings officially purchased the entirety of your distressed debt from your private equity backers." Preston stepped back, the blood draining from his face as the realization hit him like a physical blow. "Carmichael Holdings, that's you know. That's impossible. You had $30. "I inherited a hospital," Valerie corrected him, her eyes locking onto his with lethal intensity. "And underneath that hospital, I found the vault where your great-grandfather, Montgomery Winthrop, hid the gold he stole from psychiatric patients. The patients he tortured, Preston." The word tortured echoed through the silent ballroom. The Vanguard executive stepped away from Preston as if he were suddenly contagious. "You're insane," Preston hissed, panic cracking his voice. "This is slander. I'll sue you into the ground." "You can't afford to sue a parking meter," Valerie replied coldly. She opened the folder and pulled out a stack of high-resolution photocopies of the Oakhaven ledgers. She handed the stack to a nearby journalist from the New York Times, who eagerly snatched them up. "These ledgers detail exactly how the Winthrop fortune was built on blood, corruption, and embezzlement. They also detail how your grandfather funneled that dirty money into the foundation of Winthrop Capital." Preston lunged forward, but Harrison Gable stepped smoothly in his path, blocking him. "As the majority holder of your debt, Preston." Valerie continued, her voice echoing with finality. "I am calling the loans, all of them, effective immediately. You have 48 hours to vacate the properties, surrender the firm's assets, and hand over the keys to the cars. You are entirely, completely bankrupt." Savannah let go of Preston's arm, backing away in horror. "Bankrupt, Preston? What is she talking about?" Preston couldn't answer. He collapsed into a nearby velvet chair, his head in his hands, completely broken. The legacy of his family, his wealth, his reputation, vanished in a matter of minutes. Valerie looked down at him, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of the past 10 years finally lift from her shoulders. She didn't feel joy, just a profound, absolute peace. She turned her back on the ruined Billionaire and walked out of the Plaza Hotel, stepping into the crisp Manhattan night where a fleet of black SUVs waited to take her home to Oakhaven. 6 months later, the Winthrop scandal dominated every major news network. The SEC and the FBI had raided Preston's offices, resulting in federal indictments for massive financial fraud. Savannah had filed for divorce the very next morning, demanding an annulment, but she was left with nothing but legal fees. Preston was ultimately sentenced to 8 years in a federal penitentiary for securities fraud, stripped of every luxury he had ever known. As for Valerie, she never returned to the toxic socialite circles of Manhattan. Instead, she used a fraction of the limitless wealth from the subterranean vault to fully renovate the grounds of Oakhaven Sanatorium. The dark, terrifying asylum was demolished, and in its place, she built the Carmichael Center for Psychological Healing, a state-of-the-art, free-of-charge mental health sanctuary surrounded by the peaceful Catskills timberland. Deep beneath the new gardens, securely locked behind the titanium door, the gold of the robber barons remained untouched. It was no longer a monument to greed, but the foundation of a new legacy, one built by a woman who had lost everything, only to unearth the ultimate power to rewrite her own destiny. If you were captivated by Valerie's incredible journey from a penniless, betrayed ex-wife to a billionaire mastermind who conquered high society, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this thrilling story of ultimate revenge with your friends and family. Subscribe to our channel for more jaw-dropping real-life tales of hidden treasures, shocking betrayals, and sweet vindication. Ring the notification bell so you never miss an update. Leave a comment below with your favorite twist.